Welcome to ABP News, Mr. Jason Wood. And I hope you are keeping safe in this global pandemic of COVID-19 because it's a challenging time for public servants.
Yeah.
So, how are you doing? Namaste.
Yeah.
Let me begin my question to you, Minister Wood. That India and Australia share a very warm relation, and India and Australia has a big diaspora relation, especially like a huge number of Indian community is there in Australia, and over 100,000 Indian students are there.
Absolutely.
Being in charge of the community issues, community safety, how are you taking care of Indian students, those who are studying in Australia? And I'm sure like their parents are also worried that how their kids are being taken care. So if you can just share what your government is doing.
First of all, can I say Australia has a very strong relationship with India. In actual fact, in Australia, soon you'll see more Indian Australian citizens than China. China was number one when it came to foreign born. So soon India will overtake China. And the great thing about the Indian community in Australia, they're very business focused. They want to do well. They're entrepreneurs, and they've come here, and they obviously still have very close ties with Indian community. Can I also make the point too? In Australia, nearly 50% of Australians, they were either born overseas or one parent was. So you find Australia is actually a very multicultural community. So when it comes to the international students which come here from India and other countries, first of all, they have a very strong Indian connection through those who have been here in the past. And can I say, when we speak to our friends in the various Indian communities, whether it be the Hindu community or Punjabi or Gujarati, they have a very strong affinity and they really want to help out the Indian students. Why? Because most of them started off as students themselves. So what we're seeing, first of all, is our multicultural communities, in particular Indian communities, very much support the Indian students. Secondly, over here, the federal government has made available $7 million through the Red Cross to help out students on visas. And also we've relaxed the flexibility, ensuring, for example, a student can't actually be attending a university at the moment. They can work at home. If they've been here for more than 12 months, they can also access their super. Can I give the very key message, though, to the Indian parents who have their kids over here? We are really trying to treat your child as one of our own. Australia would have to be one of the safest places in the world to be right now. We have the most amazing health system. In actual fact, coming yesterday, we found out we have 4,000 ventilators spare. Why? Because our medical services are doing so well. We've only, with this awful COVID virus, had under 70 deaths. We've had just over, I think it's 6,000 cases. Where I'm talking from you in Victoria at the moment and Australia, there's probably less. I think yesterday we only had 20 positive cases. Why we're doing so much testing. So Australia is probably one of the safest places in the world if you're an international student to be.
I'm sure these must be very assuring words of from coming from you for parents whose kids are studying in Australia. So it's a global challenge. It's a global pandemic. And it's a unique challenge in the human mankind. Nowhere the mankind has faced this kind of challenge in the connected world. How India and Australia, being close partners to democracies, are sharing their experience and collaborating as far as this global challenge is concerned?
Well, I think it's number one, and I'm with the government and Liberal Party, and our values are very much in line with the Indian community. Indian community, when it comes to family and looking after family, looking after each other, looking after their neighbour, providing food. In actual fact, that's been a great eye-opener for the Australian community. We had the awful recent bushfires here. It was actually the Sikh community and Hindu community and the Gujaratis providing food for those in need recovering from the bushfires. In saying that too, we have a very strong business relationship. I firmly believe after the COVID-19 crisis, because of, obviously, we can't have all the reliance on China providing all the masks and all the protective equipment. You'll find countries like India and Australia will work very much closer into the future. And India will want to be more self-sufficient, the same with Australia. So you'll find we already have very strong connections, and Australians in general love the Indians. We love the Indian culture, and that's been the highlight for me as the Assistant Minister, going to all these amazing events and celebrating Diwali and Holi and all these incredible events. So I think this is only going to build the connections with Australia and India.
So you raised a very important point by saying that, now world has to think over regarding the reliance on China for the global supplies, for the manufacturing. And this is a very important point, because recently the Australian Foreign Minister, Mayor Spain, very vociferously raised the issue about a global inquiry, an independent inquiry as far as this COVID-19 crisis is concerned. And I read your social media post regarding that. Could you please elaborate on that? That what do you mean by an independent inquiry and at an arm's length with to WHO? This is what you referred to.
Yeah. So what happened? You've had the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, and also the Foreign Minister Marise Payne, and they have been very strong, including myself. And we have, for example, we look at the World Health Organization, and there has been some issues. For example, Australia, before any international travel ban was put in place, Australia actually put in the travel ban with China. The Chinese Communist Party was not happy. It was the right decision to make. The Australian government was criticised by officials in the World Health Organization, saying this is not needed. Why are you doing this? So therefore, if you're going to have any inquiry, you can't have, it's like, as the Foreign Minister Marise Payne said, you can't have the poacher and the gatekeeper and the warden looking at themselves. You need someone outside, independent. We have to be obviously we'd be expecting and hoping that countries like India will get involved. And I know Prime Minister Morrison will be speaking to counterparts in America and the UK, and I've seen in Germany and other places. The other issue too, which I've personally raised, and this was over, I think it was the 1st of March, was my personal great concern over the wildlife wet markets right around the world. In particular, we've had the SARS epidemic start from a Chinese wildlife wet market, and now we've had COVID-19. Again, all paths are leading to a wildlife wet market. These have to be completely outlawed and banned. We have no issue with selling, for example, fish and domestic chickens and everything else like that. But when you're going into selling bats for human consumption, which are disease-ridden, mixing with a market where there's, say, chickens, it's just a concoction which goes horribly wrong. And we've seen that happen twice. Again, our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, has called out the World Health Organization and said, you have to call this out. And initially, the World Health Organization wouldn't do it. These are the issues in Australia we have. And can I say these concerns are also strongly supported in the wider Australian Indian community. They have shared the same concerns. They come to me and say, your government's doing the right thing. We need to do something about this.
You raise a very important point about the wet markets of China. And, you were one of the first leaders in Australia to raise this flag about the wet markets and the health risks they pose. But being a sovereign country, China, how can the world community pressurize, or world community can persuade China to shut down these markets? Because we have seen SARS, and we have now going through the novel coronavirus crisis.
Well, can I make the point? First of all, and when I first raised the wildlife wet markets, in actual fact, we're in government. My opposition counterparts criticised me and saying, hey, it's racism. You shouldn't be talking about this. But this is precisely, if people like me and other politicians around the world, whether it be in India or America or wherever else, don't have the courage to stand up and say this is wrong, nothing will change. So by someone like me standing up as a local member of parliament, and also as assistant minister in home affairs. And I can tell you now that the Chinese Communist Party is probably not too happy with my comments, and they will be filtered back to China. And China can take the lead on this and should take the lead on this. And I've no doubt if other countries start raising it. And can I make the very valid point here? The Chinese public in China, especially Wuhan province, also the victims. People are being buried without funerals. And this is happening all around the world. And one of my close friends died last week. Nothing to do with the virus, but I couldn't go to his funeral. We owe it to every single victim around the world and family member, those who've lost jobs, those who are actually isolated now in India and other places, that we do have to put some transparency on China to do the right thing and actually work closely to make sure this never happens again. Like you said, and as I pointed out before, this has happened through SARS, it's happened now through COVID-19. And can I say these wet markets are not only in Asian countries, they're around the world. We need the World Health Organization to take a very strong position and stance on this.
People are also raising the questions about the role of WHO, and also some of the countries like Germany and other countries, including United States. There are voices that now China should be asked to pay for this because 170,000 people have lost their life due to this COVID crisis. Do you think that this is a time for a new global reform and making China accountable for these kind of things?
Well, it's what our Prime Minister has said, Scott Morrison and others, including myself. China has to be transparent with what has occurred, so it never happens again. Whether if this had occurred in Australia, if this had started in Australia, we'd say, hey, for the rest of the world, come and have a look. We want to make sure it never happens again. Our markets here, our markets would never be the epicenter of one of these awful pandemics. Like we have Queen Victoria Market in Melbourne. Can I say it's very, very popular with the Indian community, and they know everyone knows it's just a safe place. There's nothing weird and wonderful there. It's a safe place, and that's what we need to be occurring right around the world. Because otherwise, and this is what the virologists and other experts are saying, this will happen again, and we cannot allow this to happen again. It's because it's, as you mentioned before, all these poor victims. I just think about all these poor families right around the world. And Australia, we've lost, I think it's in the vicinity of 70 or so people. And every one of those families is hurting now. Over here, we have businesses closed, the same as in India. We're getting closer to reopening. We're going for next week. We'll be having what's called elective surgery reopened in hospitals. Why? Because we're very confident in that. But other countries have really, really suffered in this COVID-19. Australia did actually go very early, very hard to make sure we're protecting our citizens. And I know India's done the same, but we just can't let this happen again.
So let me get back to the point you raised earlier about the challenge about the global supplies. This is a time when China not only is a place from where the virus was originated, but also in a way they are getting benefited out of it because they are earning huge money. The buy face masks, PPE kit, diagnostic kits. All of the stuff is coming from China. And in India, recently we are facing a challenge that at a time of this crisis, we bought diagnostic kits, and now these kits are being they have come out as faulty kits. I'm sure Australia must have also faced similar problems. Some other countries have also faced problems like the faulty PPE kits or the face mask. Isn't it an issue regarding not only quality, but how you are responding to a global crisis, which is a health crisis where the lives are involved?
Well, in Australia, we under, again, being in home affairs, and my portfolio responsibility is to oversee the Australian Border Force. And the Australian Border Force under biosecurity acted very quickly when we realised that these dodgy kits were coming in, and others weren't approved from what's called our Therapeutic Goods Administration. Australia has a really high level of medical standards here. So any of these products now coming in, if it hasn't got the right paperwork, we are seizing those and destroying those. We did have the issue earlier on, and I was again critical, where we had in January and February during our bushfires, a lot of this personal equipment was being purchased by Australian Chinese business people, sent back to China, and it did leave us short. In Australia now, as I said before, we've now manufactured over 4,000 ventilators in quick time. Masks and gowns are also under production. So Australia's become very sufficient very quickly. And I know India will be going down the same path, where in these areas we must, first of all, a country must have its own capability and capacity to look after its own citizens first. And this is a key thing Australia's now doing.
So my final question to you is that how India and Australia, after this crisis, being close partners, two close friends, can collaborate, bring changes to the global order, because this is an issue which concerns life. This concerns the global health challenge. So how India and Australia are looking forward, and would you urge India to come forward, take lead on this issue, being the second most populous country on earth? So how are you going to, how Australia is looking at India as partner, and would you urge India to come forward and make China accountable for these kind of issues?
Well, number one, I've the greatest respect for Indian members of Parliament, your Prime Minister Modi. So I won't be making any calls on India. However, I'm sure you'll have in the future Prime Minister Morrison and Foreign Affairs Minister Marise Payne having those conversations. Can I just take it back a few steps? And even locally, in my own electorate before I was a minister, I got behind very much putting funding into the local Gurdwaras here at Pakenham and Officer. And to give you some idea, there's 150 electorates in Australia, and I have just over 100,000 people. And the reason I gave them each over, I think it was 600,000 Australian dollars, because I saw how amazingly they were doing in the local community when it comes to support. Now, as Assistant Minister, I'm now looking after the whole country, and I'm now looking after and want to support other groups who are doing the same sort of work in the Hindu community, in the Baptist community, in the Gujarati community. I want to expand this further out, and I think that's a good way of working closely together. So then, and the reason I say that is because the Australian Indians will then report back to the Indian wider population back home and say, hey, Australia and India are very, very close. The Australian government's very supportive. And also, I'll make a final point here, is something I'm very passionate about, is the second language, to make sure the Indian young people over here learn the Punjabi language, Hindi language, and Gujarati. And that's something I want to push right across the country. And also, when it comes to safer community, we've also given a lot of grants across the country to the Hindu temples, and that's something I've been very proud of. So, and the reason I make that point, it just shows we already have an Australian government working very closely and supporting the grassroots organisations in the Indian community. And the simple reason why the Indian community in Australia does so much in the time needed, whether it be the bushfires or they're out today helping international students. So my final message again to the parents of India, we're treating your children like our own, and we'll make sure we get through this together, and your children couldn't be in a safer place in the world than in Australia.
Thank you very much for sharing spending your time talking to ABP News and sharing these reassuring words, and also sharing your ideas about the way forward for entire world as far as the global pandemic is concerned and the global order is concerned. Thank you very much, Mr. Jason.
Thank you so much.
ABP News, आपको रखे आगे।